The small town of Thornbrook lay quietly under the dull glow of the late afternoon sun, casting long, twisted shadows across the streets. The air felt thick, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to shift, something to happen. It had been years since anything significant had occurred in this sleepy corner of the world, and the officers at the Thornbrook police station had grown used to the slow rhythm of the days, answering minor calls, managing local disturbances, and dealing with the occasional lost pet. Inside the station, Officer Samuel Gray sat at his desk, the faint hum of the old ceiling fan his only companion. The station, worn from years of neglect, smelled faintly of old coffee and stale paper. The yellowed walls, covered in old missing person posters and decades-old notices, offered little comfort to anyone seeking refuge. But Samuel had long since stopped caring about the dreariness of his surroundings. He was too tired to think of anything beyond the workday ahead. Samuel was a man of middle age, his once dark hair now speckled with gray, a reflection of the years he had spent quietly watching life go by. His eyes, however, had the kind of weariness that suggested he'd seen much more than he cared to admit. His once strong sense of justice had been dulled by years of routine, replaced by a quiet cynicism that seeped into his every decision. But today, something felt different. There was a restlessness in the air, a discomfort that Samuel couldn't shake. His unease grew as he stared at the clock, waiting for the next call. He had no idea that in a few moments, his entire world would be turned upside down. Suddenly, the doors of the station swung open with a loud creak. A large shadow filled the doorway, causing Samuel to look up. Standing in the threshold was a figure unlike any other. It was a massive gorilla, its broad chest heaving as it stepped into the station. Its eyes, dark and soulful, locked onto Samuel's as though it had a message to deliver. The gorilla held something in its arms, a tiny, swaddled bundle. Samuel blinked, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Was this a joke? A prank? But there was no mistaking the look of intensity in the gorilla's gaze. No mistaking the strange sense of purpose in its every movement. The creature gently lowered the bundle onto the floor before Samuel, then stepped back, its eyes never leaving the officer. Samuel stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The room seemed to grow colder, the faint sound of the wind outside howling through the cracks in the walls. "Is this a prank?" Samuel finally found his voice, his words hoarse, unsure. But the gorilla didn't respond. It simply turned and slowly exited the building, vanishing into the shadows of the town, as if it had completed its task. The silence in the station was suffocating. Samuel's hands trembled as he knelt to inspect the bundle. His breath caught in his throat as he slowly unwrapped the cloth. Inside, he found a baby, a newborn, impossibly small and fragile, with wide, frightened eyes as though it recognized him. His heart raced. The baby's cries echoed in the room, soft but insistent. What was going on here, and why had a gorilla brought this child to him? The siren of an approaching ambulance broke the tense silence in the station. Samuel still hadn't moved from his position by the child, his hands hovering uncertainly over the small figure. A part of him, the officer in him, wanted to call for backup, to investigate, to demand answers. But there was something about the baby's gaze that stopped him. The way it looked at him, as if it knew he was the one who could help, stirred a deep, unexpected sense of responsibility within him. The door opened again, and Officer Elena Martinez, a young and sharp officer, walked in, her face immediately shifting into concern as she saw the child in Samuel's arms. "What is this?" she asked softly, her eyes darting between Samuel and the baby, clearly unsure of what she was seeing. "Is this a joke?" "I don't think so," Samuel replied, his voice shaky. A gorilla brought it here." "A gorilla?" Elena asked, her eyebrows furrowing. "Is that what happened? Are you sure?" Samuel nodded slowly. "I swear it. It just came in, like it knew something we didn't." Elena glanced at the door as if expecting the gorilla to return, but there was no sign of it. She crouched down to take a closer look at the baby, whose cries had quieted as it gazed up at Samuel with a strange sense of calm. "Would a gorilla bring a baby to the police?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though she were trying to make sense of an impossible puzzle. Samuel had no answer. His mind was racing, but he couldn't find the logic. What was happening here? Was this some kind of twisted prank, or was it something far darker? The child was placed in a small crib in the corner of the station's office, swaddled in the same blanket that had been wrapped around it by the gorilla. Officer Samuel Gray and Officer Elena Martinez sat at opposite ends of the room, exchanging occasional glances, each trying to make sense of the events that had unfolded in the last hour. The calmness of the baby seemed almost out of place, like an eerie contrast to the chaos in the air. "I don't get it, Samuel," Elena said, her voice tinged with frustration. "How is this even possible? A gorilla and a baby? It's just too strange." Samuel ran his hand through his graying hair. The events didn't make sense, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was right in front of him. There was a connection between the gorilla and this baby, something deeper than the obvious mystery of its sudden appearance. The baby's wide eyes never left them. There was a wisdom there that seemed unnatural for such a small child. It was as though the baby knew things it shouldn't, as though it understood the chaos around it, even though it was just a newborn. "Something's off about this whole situation," Samuel muttered, standing up from his chair and pacing the room. That gorilla, it wasn't just a random animal. It was deliberate. It brought the child here for a reason. As he paced, his eyes landed on the baby again. The small child was still awake, staring intently at him, and Samuel couldn't help but feel a strange bond forming. He knew it was irrational. He knew he should be focusing on the logical questions. Why did a gorilla bring the baby here? Who was this child? And most importantly, where had the gorilla come from? But there was something else. An odd sensation of being watched, as though the baby was studying him, observing him with a quiet, knowing gaze. The feeling sent a chill down his spine. "I need to call for help," Elena said, breaking the silence. "I'll contact the local authorities and we'll figure this out." But Samuel didn't answer right away. He was too lost in his thoughts, his mind racing with possible explanations. The town had been quiet for so long. Was it possible that something beyond their understanding was beginning to take shape here? He couldn't shake the feeling that this baby was more than it seemed. Just as Elena stepped out of the office to make the call, a knock echoed through the station. A lone figure stood at the door, silhouetted by the fading light outside. The stranger was tall, draped in a long black coat, and his face obscured by the shadows. The air around him seemed to carry a sense of unease, and Samuel instinctively reached for his service weapon, though he did not draw it. "Can I help you?" Samuel asked cautiously, his eyes never leaving the stranger's form. The man stepped forward into the dim light of the station, revealing a face that was gaunt, pale, and hard to read. His features were sharp, his eyes narrow but intense, scanning the room with an unsettling focus. There was an air of familiarity about him, as though Samuel had seen him somewhere before, though he couldn't place where. "I'm looking for the child," the man said, his voice low and steady, carrying a weight of command that sent a shiver through Samuel's spine. "The child?" Samuel asked, his grip tightening on the edge of the desk. "What do you mean?" The stranger's eyes flicked to the crib in the corner where the baby lay quietly, staring back at him. "I need the child," the man repeated, his voice colder now. "It's important. You don't understand what's happening here. You don't know what it's capable of." Samuel felt a surge of adrenaline at the man's words. Something in his tone had shifted. Something darker. This wasn't just some random stranger. This was someone who knew about the baby, about the mystery surrounding it. "What are you talking about?" Samuel demanded. "Who are you, and what do you want with this baby?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the door as if checking to ensure no one was watching. Then, in a whisper, he spoke again. "The gorilla didn't bring the child by accident. It's here for a reason. You need to protect it, and you need to protect yourself." Before Samuel could respond, Elena stepped back into the room, her phone still in her hand. She looked at the stranger with suspicion, then at Samuel. "Who is this?" she asked cautiously. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer to the crib, his eyes fixed on the baby. The baby, who had been quiet until now, let out a soft cry. The sound sent a wave of tension through the room. Samuel couldn't help but feel as if something was unraveling. But before he could make sense of it, the man spoke again, this time with a finality that made Samuel's heart race. "You don't have much time," the stranger said, his voice now laced with urgency. "You need to prepare for what's coming." Elena stepped between the stranger and the crib, her expression a mix of confusion and alarm. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice growing firmer. "Why should we believe you? Who are you?" The man remained silent for a moment, his eyes not leaving the baby. Then, with a deep breath, he turned to face them both. His face, though pale, showed the wear of someone who had been through far too much. His eyes were filled with something. Grief? Fear? "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said, "but you'll find out soon enough." Samuel felt a sinking feeling in his stomach, like the ground was shifting beneath him. He wasn't sure if he could trust this stranger, but one thing was clear. He knew something. He knew about the child, about the gorilla, and whatever dark force was connected to it all. Before Samuel could respond, the man gave a curt nod, as though he had said all he needed to say. "The truth will come for you, and when it does, you'll be forced to choose. Protect the child or lose everything." With that, he turned and walked out of the station, leaving the two officers standing in stunned silence, their minds reeling from the weight of his words. As the door closed behind him, Samuel could feel a cold draft sweep through the room. He glanced back at the crib, where the baby now lay perfectly still, its eyes watching him with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. The evening had fallen into an eerie quiet. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, as though nature itself was protesting the unnatural events unfolding within the walls of the police station. Samuel sat at his desk, hands clasped tightly together, his mind racing. Elena stood beside the crib, her face pale, her gaze fixed on the baby. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "I don't like this, Samuel." Elena finally broke the silence. "There's something wrong with this whole situation. This baby, the gorilla, that man. None of it makes sense." Samuel didn't respond immediately. His thoughts were clouded with a mix of fear and confusion. The words of the stranger echoed in his mind. "You'll be forced to choose." But choose what? He had no answers, only more questions. The baby stirred in the crib, its tiny fingers curling into a fist. Its eyes, wide and unblinking, stared directly at Samuel, as if it was waiting for him to make a move. He couldn't shake the feeling that the baby was aware of something that they weren't, that it understood the chaos that had descended on the town. Suddenly, the door of the station slammed open, and Officer Gray's breath hitched as he saw who had entered. It was the gorilla. It stood in the doorway, its massive frame casting a shadow that stretched across the room. The air seemed to freeze, the temperature dropping as if the creature had brought with it the chill of 1,000 forgotten secrets. The gorilla's eyes, too, locked onto the baby in the crib. It didn't make a sound, but the tension in the room was palpable. Elena instinctively stepped in front of the crib, her hand on her sidearm, though she knew it wouldn't be enough against the sheer strength of the beast. "No!" Samuel shouted, his voice shaking with fear. "Get away from the baby!" But the gorilla didn't move toward them. Instead, it reached down, its massive hand gently brushing against the baby's blanket. For a moment, the room was still, no one daring to breathe. Then, in an almost tender motion, the gorilla placed something in the crib, a small, ancient-looking object. Its surface covered in strange runic symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. As the object made contact with the blanket, a low, rumbling growl emanated from the gorilla's chest, as though it was communicating something that none of them could understand. The tension in the room was unbearable, and Samuel found himself rooted to the spot, unable to speak. Elena slowly approached the crib, her fingers trembling as she reached down to pick up the object. As soon as her hand touched it, a jolt of energy coursed through her as if something unseen had connected to her very soul. She gasped, dropping the object back into the crib. "What is this?" Yelena whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear. The room grew darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally, as if the world itself was bending under the weight of the object's presence. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest, the air growing thick with a palpable sense of dread. The stranger's voice came from behind them, making them all jump. He had returned, though this time he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a shadowy figure, tall and imposing, its features obscured by a dark cloak. "This is what I was trying to warn you about," the stranger continued, his voice gravely serious. "That object is a key to something far worse than you can imagine. The baby, it's the guardian, the one who holds the power to control it." Elena's breath caught in her throat. "The baby?" The stranger nodded, stepping forward as the baby stared at him with those eerie, knowing eyes. "The child is not just a child. It's the keeper of a force older than time itself. It was brought here to protect the town, to protect you. But its power is not meant for humans. You cannot control it." Samuel's mind was reeling, trying to make sense of the stranger's words. He couldn't deny the gravity of the situation. Everything about this moment felt like the breaking point of something much larger, something far beyond his comprehension. "Who is that?" Samuel demanded, his voice shaking. The figure behind the stranger stepped forward, lifting its hood. The face that was revealed was not human, at least not anymore. Its eyes were black pits, empty and hollow. Its skin was ashen and cracked, a sharp contrast to the smoothness of its cloak. The creature's lips parted into a cruel, unsettling smile. "I am the one who seeks the power," it said in a low, raspy voice, "and I will take it from you." Before anyone could react, the creature lunged forward, its hand reaching toward the crib, its fingers stretched like claws, ready to seize the baby and the power it contained. The world seemed to explode in chaos. Samuel acted on instinct. He pulled out his weapon, aiming directly at the creature, but the shot didn't seem to matter. The creature moved with an unnatural speed, its limbs twisting in impossible angles as it ducked and dodged, avoiding the gunfire. The gorilla, meanwhile, charged forward, roaring in fury, its massive arms swinging with deadly force. Samuel's heart raced. Everything felt like a nightmare, a surreal, horrifying nightmare. He couldn't let this creature take the baby, couldn't let it take whatever dark power lay within. In the chaos, Elena grabbed the ancient object from the crib, holding it tightly in her hand. The moment she touched it, a surge of power shot through her, and she felt a connection, a bond to something ancient, something primal. The world seemed to shift around her, the air thickening, the walls of the station warping, as though the very fabric of reality was bending. "Hold it!" the stranger yelled, his voice strained. "You don't understand what you're doing." But Elena couldn't stop. The power coursed through her, and she instinctively raised the object high above her head. The room trembled, the very ground beneath them shaking, as though the earth was responding to the object's presence, and the gorilla let out a deafening roar, and the creature with the hollow eyes hissed in frustration. Then the room went silent. The air was thick with a supernatural force, and Samuel could feel it. He could feel the change, an oppressive weight that seemed to crush the life out of everything. The walls shimmered, the floor buckled, and suddenly there was nothing but a vast void around them. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The baby, its eyes shone with an otherworldly light, and as the light grew brighter, the creature staggered backward, its form flickering, becoming transparent, as if it was no longer able to hold its own substance. The gorilla growled, but it too seemed to be affected by the baby's power, stumbling backward in confusion and fear. And then, with a blinding flash, everything stopped. The light faded, the room returned to its original state, but the creature was gone. The gorilla too vanished as if they had never been there. Elena collapsed to her knees, the ancient object falling from her hand. Samuel rushed to her side, his pulse still racing. They were left in a tense, breathless silence, the air thick with the lingering traces of the power they had just witnessed. The baby, now calm again, stared at them with those knowing eyes, as if it had always been in control. The air in the station felt heavy, thick with the remnants of the power that had just surged through the building. Samuel sat on the floor, his hand on his forehead, as if he could wipe away the confusion that clouded his mind. His heartbeat was still thundering in his chest, the adrenaline fading but leaving behind a deep exhaustion. Elena sat beside him, her back pressed against the wall. She was trembling, her eyes wide, staring into nothingness, trying to process everything that had just happened. The baby had fallen back to sleep in the crib, its tiny chest rising and falling peacefully as though nothing had happened. But Elena knew better. Whatever had just transpired, it wasn't over. "We're alive," Samuel said, his voice hoarse, "but I don't understand any of it. Helena's fingers brushed through her hair as she looked down at the floor. Neither do I. I feel like we're just pawns in something bigger, something ancient. Her words echoed in the quiet room, and for a moment the two of them sat in silence, the weight of the truth settling in. It wasn't just the creature, the gorilla, or the mysterious baby. It was something far older, something far more powerful than they could understand. The stranger, who had disappeared during the chaos, suddenly appeared in the doorway again. His expression was grim, as though he too was haunted by the events that had unfolded. "It's not over," he said quietly. "You've only seen a glimpse of what's coming. That creature, it's part of a force that's been lurking in the shadows for centuries, and now it knows where to find the power." "Power," Samuel repeated, his voice trembling. "What do you mean?" The stranger walked into the room, his eyes flickering to the crib, where the baby slept soundly, unaware of the conversation. "The baby is more than you can imagine. It holds the key to something ancient, a force of unimaginable power. That creature wasn't just a monster. It was a guardian, one of many who protect the secret, who protect the power that the baby possesses." Elena stood up slowly, still weak from the ordeal, but determined to understand. "You said it was a guardian. Why does it want the baby?" The stranger's gaze turned cold, his eyes darkening. "The baby is not just a child. It's a vessel for the power that can either save or destroy everything. There are those who will stop at nothing to possess it, and you," he paused, his voice softening, "you can either protect it or let it fall into the wrong hands." Samuel's mind reeled. What kind of choice is that? Protect it from what? Who's going to come after it? The stranger shook his head slowly, his face grave. "You won't know until it's too late. But trust me, there are forces out there that want that power, forces that have waited centuries for the right moment, and that moment is coming." As the stranger left the room, Samuel and Elena were left alone again with the baby, the silence settling over them like a thick fog. Elena knelt beside the crib, her hand resting gently on the edge. The baby's breathing was steady and calm, its little face serene. But Elena could not shake the feeling that the baby was not just a baby. It was something more, something that had been brought into their lives for a reason they were still trying to understand. "What now?" Samuel asked, his voice heavy with the burden of what they had learned. Elena looked up at him, her face filled with a quiet resolve. "We protect it. We do whatever it takes to keep it safe." But deep inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just their fight. They were caught in something far larger than they could comprehend. Days passed, and life at the police station returned to a semblance of normalcy. The strange occurrences seemed to fade, as if the storm had passed. But for Samuel and Elena, nothing would ever be the same again. They had learned the truth about the baby, and they knew that the forces that sought it would never stop. The stranger, who had come and gone, left them with a parting message. "Keep it hidden. You'll need to be ready for when the time comes." But for now they had to wait. The town, still haunted by the events, remained peaceful for the time being. But the shadow of the unknown still loomed over them. As they sat together in the station, Elena looked at Samuel, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself a small smile. We'll be ready. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Samuel nodded, though a part of him felt uncertain. He couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was only just beginning. And in the crib, the baby slept on, its eyes still glowing faintly in the darkness. Weeks had passed since the night of the confrontation, and although life at the police station had resumed its routine, a sense of unease still clung to Elena and Samuel. The baby was growing, and with each passing day they could feel its presence becoming more profound, as if it held a weight that they couldn't understand. One morning, a storm rolled in. The clouds gathered ominously in the sky, the wind howling against the windows of the station. A sharp knock on the door interrupted their thoughts. Samuel opened it to find a familiar face, one they hadn't seen since the night of the attack. The stranger had returned. "Something's coming," the stranger said, his voice tense and urgent. "You need to listen to me." Elena stepped forward, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. "What's happening?" The stranger's eyes darted nervously to the crib where the baby slept. "The guardians, they are not just trying to protect the child, they are here for it. They are coming to reclaim what is theirs." "But you said they were protectors," Samuel protested. "Why would they come after it now?" "Because it's not just a guardian," the stranger replied gravely. "There's a secret buried deep within the child, something that will give the one who controls it unimaginable power. And the guardians, they are here to ensure that power does not fall into the wrong hands." Elena's heart raced. "Who else wants the baby? Who else is after it?" The stranger's face hardened. "I wish I knew. All I know is that whoever they are not human." That night, Elena couldn't sleep. The air in the station felt thick with anticipation, as if the very walls were holding their breath. She stood by the crib, staring down at the baby, trying to understand the gravity of what the stranger had said. A sudden flash of memory hit her, an image of an old journal she had found earlier, hidden in the archives of the station. The journal had been written by a former officer who had mysteriously vanished years ago. The pages were filled with strange symbols and cryptic messages, nothing that made sense at first. But now, with everything she had learned, the pieces began to fall into place. The officer had written about the Circle, an ancient group of beings who existed outside the normal realm of human perception. They were rumored to have created beings with extraordinary abilities, entities born from a fusion of dark magic and unknown forces. The baby, this child, was one of them. A chill ran through her. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the baby was no ordinary child. It was a vessel for a power that had been hidden for millennia. The storm raged on that night, the wind howling louder than before. Samuel and Elena had barricaded themselves inside the station, the baby resting quietly in the corner. The stranger had warned them to prepare for the guardian's arrival, but the question remained: what would happen when they came? Suddenly, the lights flickered. The wind outside seemed to pause for a moment, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The doors of the station groaned open with a loud creak, as if something unseen was pushing against them. Through the crack of the door, a dark, shadowy figure stepped inside. The guardians had arrived. They were tall, cloaked in flowing robes, their faces hidden in darkness. They moved with an eerie grace, their presence unnerving, as if they existed on a plane just slightly outside of reality. As they entered, the temperature dropped, the shadows in the room grew deeper, and the very air seemed to hum with the presence of something ancient and powerful. "Give it to us," one of them intoned, its voice low and resonating. It is time for the child to fulfill its purpose." Samuel and Elena exchanged a terrified glance. The stranger had told them that the guardians were powerful, but he hadn't prepared them for this. The guardians stood in a circle around the crib, their presence so overwhelming that Samuel felt like he couldn't breathe. The child lay still, its eyes closed, as though it was unaware of the looming danger. "No," Elena said, her voice trembling but determined. "We won't give it to you." The guardian nearest to her turned its head slightly, as if considering her words. "You have no choice," it replied. "The child is not yours to protect. It belongs to us." Samuel stepped forward, trying to shield the baby with his body. "We won't let you take it, not without a fight." The room grew colder, the shadows growing darker. Elena could feel the pressure mounting, a deep, unnatural pull, as though the guardians were drawing the energy out of the very room. The temperature plummeted, and her breath came out in visible puffs. A voice broke the tension. "I told you this wasn't over." The stranger stepped forward again, his face filled with grim resolve. He raised his hand, and a strange, glowing symbol appeared on the floor, illuminating the room with an ethereal light. The guardians recoiled slightly, as though the symbol repelled them. "It's too late," one of them said, its voice like a whisper in the wind. "You cannot stop what has already begun." The stranger's expression darkened. "You're wrong," he said, his voice steady. "You haven't seen what the child can do yet." And with that, a surge of energy exploded from the crib. The guardian stumbled back as the baby's eyes opened, glowing with an intense, unnatural light. The room shook, the walls rattling as the energy surged through the air. The guardians screamed, a sound like the howl of 1,000 winds as they were blasted back into the shadows. The light from the baby flickered for a moment, then vanished, leaving only silence in its wake. The guardians were gone, but the storm outside continued to rage, a reflection of the chaos that had just unfolded. The stranger stood by the door, his face grim. "You don't understand. The guardians are only a small part of a much larger force. There's still more coming." Elena stood by the crib, looking down at the child. "What are we supposed to do now?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at the child, his eyes filled with both awe and fear. "Keep the child hidden. You must protect it at all costs. The true battle hasn't even begun yet." Samuel stepped forward. "What do you mean? Who else is coming?" The stranger's face hardened. "Others. Those who were once human. Those who have been waiting for this moment. They are the ones who created the child, and they will stop at nothing to take it back." And with those final words, the stranger turned and left. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Elena and Samuel to face the unknown alone.